I had been in the business world long enough to know how quickly power dynamics can shift, how one moment of arrogance can lead to catastrophic consequences. It was a Thursday afternoon when I witnessed something that still sends chills down my spine. I was sitting in a high-end restaurant in Manhattan, a glass of scotch in hand, when I saw it. Keith Thompson, the CEO of Transtech Innovations, was sitting at a table near the back. His demeanor was calm, his posture exuding the confidence of a man who had just closed a billion-dollar deal. But what caught my attention wasn't his usual authoritative presence, it was his outfit. Keith had always been known for his sharp suits, the kind that cost as much as a mid-sized car. But today, he had chosen something unconventional. A wrinkled, off-brand polo shirt, khaki pants that seemed a size too small, and scuffed brown loafers. It was a far cry from his usual crisp suits, and frankly, it didn't look like the outfit of a man who had recently made one of the largest acquisitions in tech history. I didn't realize it at the time, but that outfit would become the center of an unfolding nightmare. Sitting at a nearby table was Peter Shaw, a senior executive at one of our competitor companies. Peter was the type of guy who thrived on humiliation. He enjoyed belittling others in the most public and brutal ways. And today, I watched as he did just that. He laughed loudly, making no attempt to disguise his mockery. "Well, look at that," Peter muttered to his colleagues, loud enough for everyone nearby to hear. "Looks like the CEO of a billion-dollar company can't even dress himself properly." The table around him erupted in laughter. Keith, sitting there, trying to remain composed, couldn't escape the sting of the insult. But it wasn't the outfit that would cost him everything, it was Peter's words, spoken with such disdain, that would set the entire series of events in motion. Keith looked up, and for a brief moment, I saw a flicker of something in his eyes. Not embarrassment, but something darker, something cold and calculating. And in that moment, I knew we were on the brink of a disaster. The restaurant's atmosphere grew tense as the laughter around Peter's table subsided, and for a second, it felt like everything slowed down. Keith remained still, his face unreadable. I could tell he was suppressing something, but what it was, I wasn't sure. Peter's mockery was nothing new, but there was something about the way it was done, so public, so deliberate, that made the whole situation feel different. I could see it in Keith's eyes. He wasn't just embarrassed, he was angry. But he was also calculating. He wasn't the type of person to lash out, at least not immediately. He was a strategist, a man who thrived in moments like this, where the stakes were high and the pressure was on. I could hear bits of conversation from the table near Peter, his colleagues still chuckling. But then, something unexpected happened. Keith stood up. Slowly, deliberately. He didn't say a word, but his posture told everything. He walked out of the restaurant, not in a hurry, but with purpose, his shoulders squared, eyes forward. It was clear he was done with the nonsense. I didn't follow him, there was no need to. I knew exactly what he was about to do. Within the next hour, the tech world was abuzz. Rumors began circulating about a major deal with Transtech Innovations. The company had been in the process of acquiring a smaller startup, one that was key to their future plans, and Keith had been negotiating it personally. It was a deal worth over $1.5 billion, and the timeline had been set for the following day. But suddenly, everything started to unravel. I didn't know exactly what happened at that moment, but I could sense it. Keith's call to the negotiating table had turned cold. The smaller company had made it clear that they weren't interested in moving forward. As far as they were concerned, Transtech was no longer a serious partner. By evening, news broke that the deal had collapsed. People in the industry were shocked. How could something so critical fall apart so quickly? The theories ranged from a sudden shift in market strategy to internal disagreements within Transtech, but no one really had the full story. I did. Keith had made his move. He called off the deal, not because of any new business strategy, but because of a personal slight. That mocking remark about his clothes had been more than just an insult. It was a symbol. A trigger. And Keith, as I'd come to learn that day, was a man who never forgot when he was disrespected. The fallout from the deal's collapse spread quickly. Within hours, the Transtech board was in a state of chaos. Executives scrambled to figure out what went wrong, while stock prices began to plummet. But there was something bigger at play here. This wasn't just about money, it was about power, pride, and a message. Keith Thompson, the CEO who had once been the face of Transtech's meteoric rise, had just made a move that would alter the course of the company's future. And it all began with a mocking remark about his outfit. I had a few connections in the industry, people who had an inside look at what was going on behind closed doors. One of them, a senior vice president at Transtech, sent me a cryptic message that night: "Keith's not coming back from this. He's shutting it all down." At first, I thought it was an exaggeration. But by the following morning, it was clear that the situation was much more dire than anyone had anticipated. Keith had personally pulled out of the deal. It wasn't just the negotiation that had faltered, the startup in question had done its own research. They were aware of what had happened the day before. The public humiliation. The mockery. And more importantly, they knew that Keith Thompson had taken it personally. The tech world is a small one. Word gets around fast. A company like Transtech, which had once seemed invincible, suddenly looked vulnerable. People weren't talking about the deal falling apart anymore, they were talking about Keith's reaction. They were talking about how a CEO had let his ego destroy something that could have changed everything for his company. For Keith, this wasn't just a business decision, it was a statement. A way to reassert his dominance in a world where power was everything. He wasn't going to let anyone, no matter how important they were, get away with disrespecting him. And it wasn't just the deal that collapsed. Transtech's stock price took a dive, major investors started pulling out, and other potential acquisitions fell through. Rumors spread like wildfire. Some said it was Keith's pride, others speculated it was his judgment clouded by anger. But the result was undeniable: Transtech was spiraling. As the days passed, it became clear that Keith wasn't planning to come back from this. The CEO who once commanded a billion-dollar empire was now watching it crumble because of a single, careless moment. By the end of the week, Transtech's situation had gone from bad to worse. The stock continued to plummet, and the media were all over the story. Headlines screamed about the collapse of the $1.5 billion deal, the CEO's tantrum over an outfit, and the disastrous consequences that followed. Investors who had once stood behind Keith now questioned his judgment and leadership. The board was in open conflict about the company's future direction, and whispers of a potential ousting were becoming louder by the hour. In the midst of all this chaos, I couldn't help but wonder, could Keith have handled it differently? Sure, the public mockery was in poor taste, but could it have been brushed off? Could the deal have been salvaged? Then I realized something. Keith wasn't like most CEOs. He wasn't in this game just to make money or grow the company, he was in it for control. He didn't just want to lead, he wanted to dominate, to remind everyone who the real power in the room was. And in his eyes, Peter Shaw's public mocking wasn't a simple jab, it was a threat to his authority. To his sense of self. And he had sent a clear message: if you disrespect me, you'll regret it. The final blow came when the board voted to remove him. It wasn't immediate, but it was inevitable. The shareholders demanded accountability, and the decision was made. Keith Thompson, once the face of Transtech Innovations, was out. The very company that he had built was now on the verge of collapse, not from external competition or market failure, but because of his own decisions. As for Peter Shaw, well, he was left to bask in the temporary glory of having caused Keith's downfall. But he too would learn, as the industry always teaches its players, power is fleeting. And what goes up can come crashing down just as quickly. Peter may have laughed at Keith's outfit, but it was Keith who had the last laugh. Because in the end, he had shown the world just how dangerous it could be to underestimate a man who had nothing left to lose. Months passed, and the dust began to settle, but the consequences of that fateful day would echo through the halls of Transtech for years to come. The company, now under new leadership, struggled to regain its footing. The deal that had been lost, the investors who had fled, and the public scrutiny they endured would leave scars that no rebranding or corporate restructuring could easily erase. But for Keith, the aftermath was a strange kind of liberation. He disappeared from the public eye for a while, retreating from the media's gaze and stepping out of the business world. No one knew exactly where he went, but rumors circulated that he had taken a step back, re-evaluating his life, his career, and his purpose. I ran into him at a private event about 6 months later. He looked different, more relaxed, maybe even at peace, but still carrying that quiet intensity. He didn't mention Transtech once, nor did I. There was an unspoken understanding between us that the past was done. His career in the spotlight had ended abruptly, but he had no intention of fading away completely. Keith had made a choice that day, one that not only cost him a company but also his position at the top of the tech world. Yet, in a twisted way, he seemed content with the consequences. Maybe it was because he had won the one thing that mattered most to him, respect. He had reminded the world that there were people who could play the game by their own rules, no matter the stakes. As for Peter Shaw, the mocking executive who had set it all in motion, the industry had its own way of dealing with him. His career took a sharp turn downward after Keith's departure. People who had once praised Peter now distanced themselves, as they realized the consequences of provoking someone as powerful as Keith Thompson. Peter's company saw a series of acquisitions go south, and rumors spread that investors were pulling out. One night, I heard a conversation about a deal he had been working on falling apart, the very same way Keith's had. I couldn't help but think that maybe Peter was getting a taste of his own medicine. In the end, Keith's actions were a reminder of the thin line between success and failure in the business world. Sometimes, all it takes is one small spark, a careless comment, a mocking gesture, to set off a chain reaction that can change everything. Keith had shown that in a way no one would forget, and as for Peter, his time would eventually run out. And as for me, I'd learned something valuable that day. Respect isn't just earned in the boardroom. It's earned in the way you carry yourself, in how you react when life throws you a curveball. Keith Thompson's final lesson was clear: never underestimate the consequences of your words, and never mock someone who has the power to change everything. Months after the collapse, the story of Keith Thompson and Transtech became a cautionary tale whispered in boardrooms across the industry. The headlines had faded, but the consequences of the decisions that day had created ripples that would affect the business world for years to come. Keith, while more subdued in his public appearances, wasn't entirely out of the picture. His name still carried weight, and while his reputation had taken a hit, there were whispers that he was quietly building something new, something far removed from the power struggles of Transtech. People speculated that he was preparing for a comeback, but this time, it wasn't about flaunting wealth or dominating a billion-dollar empire. He was more reflective, perhaps even humbled, in his approach. But the question on everyone's mind was whether he could regain his former standing or if the scars from his downfall would be permanent. Meanwhile, Peter Shaw's career had, unsurprisingly, suffered a dramatic shift. Once a rising star in the tech world, he found himself in a downward spiral. As Transtech's implosion continued to send shockwaves through the industry, Peter's own company was under pressure. Rumors circulated that his aggressive tactics and penchant for mockery had caught up with him. At a key investors' meeting, Peter's usual bravado was absent. His sharp remarks fell flat, and the confidence he once exuded had been replaced with palpable unease. He struggled to regain his footing as deals that should have been easy began to fall through. Investors who once viewed him as a powerful ally now saw him as a liability, someone too toxic to work with. But Peter wasn't done yet. He had spent years climbing to the top, and he wasn't about to let a string of failed deals undo his career. He started to change his approach, shifting from the arrogant executive to the humble learner. In private meetings, he began to apologize, to admit mistakes, and to appear more self-aware. But for all the attempts at redemption, the damage had been done. People in the industry knew better than to trust him fully. Then, one day, I received a message from an old contact, a senior figure at one of the major investors involved in TransTech's downfall. The message was brief but intriguing: Keith's new project is ready to launch. It's nothing like what TransTech was. This one is different. People are paying attention. Was Keith really back? And if so, what kind of leader would he be this time around? The world was waiting to find out, but in the meantime, there was one thing I knew for certain: respect, once lost, is not so easily regained. The legacy of that day, the public mockery of a CEO and the collapse of a deal, would haunt both men forever. But as Keith had shown, even the most spectacular falls can be the foundation for something new. As months turned into a year, the world watched closely for any signs of Keith Thompson's next move. The silence had been deafening, but it wasn't a silence of defeat, it was a quiet preparation. The business world was ruthless, and Keith had been burned badly, but he wasn't one to let a fall keep him down for long. Word finally leaked that Keith was in talks with a few former colleagues and investors, gathering a team to launch his new venture. It wasn't a flashy return, no grand press conferences or media storms. Instead, it was understated, even secretive. People in the industry whispered about his return, but few knew exactly what his new project was about. I got a call from an old contact one evening, one who had been close to Keith during his time at TransTech. "It's happening," he said. "He's building something. Not another tech empire, though. This time, it's different. He's focused on sustainability, innovation for the future. And this time, it's not about just making money, it's about legacy." Legacy. That word caught my attention. It wasn't just about ego anymore. It wasn't about reclaiming power. Keith, it seemed, had grown. Or perhaps he had simply learned how fragile his previous empire had been, how easily it could all slip away because of one careless moment. As I dug deeper, I learned more. His new company, Green Tech Innovations, was centered around green energy, renewable resources, and technology designed to reduce the impact of climate change. It was a completely different direction from the cutthroat tech industry he had once dominated. The project was audacious, bold, and entirely on brand with the Keith I remembered, a man who wasn't afraid to take big risks. But now, there was a sense of humility in the approach. He surrounded himself with young innovators, many of whom had never heard of the drama that had surrounded his downfall. For them, Keith was just another successful entrepreneur with a vision for the future. They didn't know the story behind the man, the failures, or the public mockery. For them, he was simply their CEO. But there was one thing they didn't realize: Keith had learned the lessons of his past. He wasn't trying to dominate the world anymore. This time, he was trying to build something meaningful, something that would stand the test of time. But no matter how hard he tried to reinvent himself, there were always whispers. And, of course, Peter Shaw was watching. He had seen Keith's return with growing concern. This wasn't the same Keith he had mocked in that restaurant. The man who had once been publicly humiliated was now stepping into a new world, one that required a different kind of leadership. A leadership Peter hadn't yet figured out for himself. Peter was still trying to rebuild his image. He had made a few investments, but nothing major. His attempts at apologizing and making amends were met with skepticism. People remembered his part in the downfall of TransTech, and they weren't so quick to forget. In a world where reputation mattered more than anything, Peter was the one left struggling to catch up. It was clear that the paths of these two men, once linked by rivalry and public mockery, were diverging. Keith was looking ahead, creating something new, while Peter remained trapped in the past, desperately trying to regain the respect he had lost. It had been 2 years since that day, the day the deal collapsed, the day Keith Thompson's career came crashing down. But as the years passed, something remarkable happened. Keith's new company, Green Tech Innovations, began to make waves. The world was taking notice. His vision for sustainable technology, powered by renewable resources, was gaining traction, and partnerships with major corporations and governments started to roll in. Investors, who once looked at him with skepticism, now saw him as a pioneer in a field that was only going to grow. Keith wasn't just back. He was redefining success on his own terms. And in doing so, he had built something that would outlast any of the vanity-driven empires he had once tried to create. This time, his legacy was tied to something bigger than himself, something that would impact generations to come. And as for Peter Shaw, well, his story was less inspiring. The once rising executive who had publicly mocked Keith was now stuck in a cycle of failed ventures and lost opportunities. He had tried to adapt, tried to rebrand himself, but his reputation, forever tied to the collapse of Transtech in his own cruel words, was a weight that he couldn't shake. Peter's company, once a competitive force in the industry, was now losing ground. Its stock value had stagnated, and major deals that he had once been certain would secure his place in the upper echelons of the business world had crumbled one after another. The cold reality set in, no one wanted to be associated with him anymore. I saw Peter at a conference one evening, sitting alone at the back of the room, far from the podium where the influential leaders gathered. His once pristine suit now seemed ill-fitting, and his face, once full of arrogant confidence, looked drawn, weary. The people around him didn't even acknowledge his presence. The harsh truth was undeniable, Peter's mockery of Keith had come full circle. It had cost him everything. I caught a glimpse of Keith at a gala event later that year. He was surrounded by influential figures from the world of sustainability, his eyes focused on a different kind of prize, a legacy that wasn't measured in dollars, but in impact. He smiled, greeted everyone with genuine warmth, and spoke passionately about the future. He had rebuilt himself, not through the traditional markers of success, but by focusing on something that could truly change the world. As for me, I couldn't help but think about the strange twists of fate that had led to this point. How something as seemingly insignificant as a public mockery, a cruel, offhand comment about an outfit, had set off a chain of events that reshaped two men's lives. Keith had learned from his downfall, while Peter remained mired in it. One had found redemption, while the other had found nothing but the consequences of his own hubris. In the end, Keith Thompson had proven the most powerful lesson of all: you can't measure success by the size of your empire or the wealth you accumulate. True success is measured by the impact you have on the world, and how you handle the failures along the way. And Peter Shaw? He had learned nothing at all.